Welcome. The presentation, as was said, and all the handouts are accessible to you. I posted the link, and I know you also have access to this in the Google Classroom, to the Padlet, where you'll be able to access the presentation and the different activities from our book, in case you don't have our book. So you still have the handouts for the different activities.
So the presentation that we'll be sharing with you is based on the book that Carol mentioned earlier. This book, it actually came out, it has a publication date of 2020. It actually came out in 2019. We started working on the content for it in 2017. Going into this, our goal was never to present ourselves as experts on this topic necessarily. We just wanted to have the opportunity to share with other educators what we ourselves had learned in the public schools, what we'd learned directly from our K-12 students, and what we'd learned from our colleagues in K-12 schools, both when we were in the classroom and then working with our graduate students who are still in the classroom. So we saw this as an opportunity to share some of what we had learned. We are definitely still a work in progress in this area, and that was so evident to us as we started going back through this material to pull what we wanted to share for this presentation. There are things that we look at now that we think, based on how we've grown in the last few years, we would have changed a little bit or phrased differently. So we just wanted to let you know that we're still learning and growing in this area as well, and we're really looking forward to our interactions with you and with this district to continue our growth in this area also.
So we want to speak a little bit to what giftedness is, just very briefly. Our National Association in Gifted Education, referred to as NAGC, so the National Association for Gifted Children, provides a definition, and then states obviously have their own definitions. New Mexico has their own definition. We just took this excerpt out of the definition from NAGC. So some gifted individuals with exceptional aptitude may not demonstrate outstanding levels of achievement, and that is bolded, italicized, underlined. When we're looking at gifted education, especially in earlier years, elementary school, even middle school, we're looking at potential as an indicator of giftedness, because children often haven't developed these domain-specific areas of giftedness when they're young. They haven't necessarily had the opportunities, the content knowledge to be able to do so. So in later stages, we might speak to talent development in terms of domain-specific giftedness, but we're mostly today going to talk about potential and aptitude and how we can develop that. So they may not demonstrate outstanding levels of achievement, although they may show potential, due to environmental circumstances such as limited opportunities to learn as a result of poverty, discrimination, or cultural barriers, or due to a physical or learning disability. So we need to take special care to identify gifted potential in these students. And that is really what Amy and I are all about, is focusing on gifted potential.
So these are the areas, if you look at that list on the left, that we focus on when we talk about underserved high potential learners. So we are specifically talking about students from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. We're talking about learners whose primary home language is not English. We're talking about students that come from a home that would be considered economically disadvantaged. But we're talking about twice exceptional students. And then as we went through the process of writing this book, we were back and forth in discussion with our editors about where students from rural communities fell. Ultimately, they ended up being termed under-resourced in our book as opposed to underserved or underrepresented. So we don't have them specifically in this presentation. We do address that group of students in our book, but also I think it's important to say that we feel like the strategies that we're sharing also apply to this group of learners, even though we don't call them out directly.
And we should say as well that even though we have these separated, I mean, these are not mutually exclusive categories, and there will be overlap as well. And we do recognize that. It just, in how we presented the book, how we present this information, we do have some of the information separated. So this book, one of our wonderful colleagues, Dr. Jean Chen-Wen Lee, actually came up with the idea to use the Giftedness Knows No Boundaries, which is one of NAGC's big campaigns to build awareness about underserved gifted populations, to improve policies and practices that create sort of supportive environments where these students can thrive. She said, you know, I think it'd be a great way to just frame the book around some of the components of this campaign. So this campaign focuses in 4 areas. There's See Me, Understand Me, Teach Me, and Challenge Me, which are the 4 of the chapters of our book, and then the 4 sessions that we're doing for you. We added a 5th session, chapter in our book called Advocate for Me, which we won't have a separate session on, but we will incorporate some of that material into the Challenge Me session, because we believe it's important, once you have this information, to share it with others, so that, you know, that ripple effect, getting more people aware of the needs of underserved populations, so that we can really make a difference, is so incredibly important. So See Me, which is today. So first, educators need to see their underserved high potential learners, acknowledge biases that prevent these students from being served, and confront issues concerning the identification of these students for advanced programming. So these are the major topics that we're going to cover with you in this presentation today. Tomorrow, we're going to talk about Understand Me. So once educators see their students, they need to understand who they are and create a culturally responsive learning environment that will help them thrive. So that will be the primary focus of tomorrow's session. And then as we move forward to October 14th, we're going to talk about Teach Me. So next, we need to identify strategies, instructional strategies that will best support our underserved gifted learners. And we believe that strategies need to focus on recognizing and developing students' strengths. And then on 10-15, we'll talk about how to challenge these students. So beyond quality teaching at the universal level, we need to challenge underserved high potential students who have already mastered grade level material. And in that session, we'll share strategies for that. But here we are in See Me. So we have this quote, and this actually frames the chapter in our book. So every day, in 100 small ways, our children ask, do you see me? Do you hear me? Do I matter? Their behavior often reflects our response. And I highlighted that in yellow. We highlighted that in yellow. So their behavior often reflects our response. Why is this topic so important? So gifted children in poverty and from minority groups are 2.5 times less likely to be identified for and in gifted and talented programs in school. We're going to talk to you a little bit later in this presentation about underrepresentation. And we're going to specifically talk, we were able to pull some statistics from Albuquerque Public Schools, but we need to do a better job, right? And so this presentation, we're hoping will give you some ideas of how to do a better job, and even, you know, validate the work that you're doing in seeing these students. So in the chat, just let us know. Have you seen this before? What does this mean to you? We have equality does not mean equity. And I'm sure many of you have seen it. But what does this mean to you? So just take a moment and in the chat, let us know. We meet kids where they are and give them what they need. Different students have different needs in order to achieve. The same is not always equal. Supports must be individualized. Absolutely. So that's what we're talking about here. Okay, awesome comments. So we already have a lot of familiarity with this concept. So equal is not always equitable. The whole philosophy of gifted education or special education is around this idea of equity, that there are going to be students that need individualized, specialized supports in order to achieve to their maximum potential. And giving them these extra supports is a good thing, right? So when we talk about equity and equality, treating all students equally implies that we are giving our students the exact same learning opportunities and support. Equity is what we are all about. Amy and I are all about. So equity needs to be our goal. Educating students in an equitable manner means we recognize and honor the diversity of our students, and we make meaningful efforts to see who they are and what they are capable of achieving, and to provide them with what they need in order to achieve to their maximum capability.
So I continue to read chat. Is this echoing for you or just for me?
I'm sorry, what?
Is it echoing?
It's echoing for us, yeah.
Okay, so I don't know. I haven't done anything differently. Is it still echoing?
No.
It's better.
Okay. So I continue to look at the chats as Jenny was talking, and great thoughtful responses. I feel like we are with a group that is very much where we are with all of this. So this is exciting. Hopefully it'll be a good few days together. On the screen right now, we have a list of what would be considered traditional characteristics of giftedness. We often in gifted education use this type of characteristic chart or checklist to look at behaviors of gifted students and to determine who we might want to recommend for gifted education programming, or who might be gifted learners in our classroom. We're going to circle back around to these characteristics in a few slides after a little bit more discussion, but I wanted to give you a chance to look at them and focus in on what some of those characteristics are. Strong communication skills, excellent memory, large vocabulary, complex sentence structure. So just take a couple of minutes to probably at this point refamiliarize yourself with some of these traditional characteristics. So we want to define a little more distinctly the different groups of students that we're going to be talking about. The first one is culturally and linguistically diverse learners. These are students, children growing up in homes that differ some way from what we consider typical white middle to upper class experiences and values. This includes, but is not limited to, all of the various groups of students whose cultural background and experience are not what we would consider mainstream culture. So that's a large group of students if we think about it. CLD also includes students whose home language is not English, that primary language that's spoken in the home, even if the students themselves are proficient in English. And we need to be careful about that word proficient, because that conversation can be proficient, whereas in the actual classroom it's not proficient. But whatever we perceive as proficient in English in our classrooms, that student, if he or she is coming from a home where English is not the primary language, they are also considered culturally and linguistically diverse, because they have some challenges potentially that other students in our classroom would not have when it comes to accessing curriculum and demonstrating strengths in academic areas. On the left is a question that I would like you to just think about briefly and maybe jot your responses to. If my CLD students had the opportunity to nominate themselves for accelerated or enrichment programs, what would they say their strengths were? So if you can think about a specific student or maybe students that you've interacted with in general, do you know them well enough that you were able to answer this question? Or what do you think they would say? How would they respond to this? And I see some popping up down here. Let me open the chat. Resilience, I just saw. And you're welcome to respond, type in some responses. Perseverance, many students say they don't know. Math, Spanish, creativity, taking care of their families. And we see this sometimes too. Experience in middle school is that they can't think of any of their strengths. Curiosity, creativity, works well with others. Art, self-motivation, creativity again. Unable to answer. Technology, videography. They don't think having a second language is a strength, and we know it so very much is, and is a great indicator of potential giftedness, depending upon how quickly they pick it up and are able to utilize it in complex ways. I just discussed this with 6th grade English learners today. They said tree climbing, speaking many languages, art, hunting, cooking, acting, and more. I love it. I love it. Music and art. Okay, yes, these are great examples of what we might hear from students about what their strengths are. Singing. Okay, English language learners. We addressed this already briefly. Students whose primary home language is not English, who experience to some degree difficulties in speaking, reading, writing, understanding English language. I'm distracted because I'm still trying to read all the fun chats coming in, so I'm actually gonna close that window for just a minute. It's important to understand that social language skills are acquired at a much quicker rate than academic language skills. And that was my comment earlier. They may seem proficient and still need that support to realize their potential in academic areas. You probably at some point have heard BICS versus CALP, so that basic language, conversational language versus the cognitive academic language proficiency. So that social language can develop in as soon as 1 to 3 years, but the academic language typically takes up to 6 years to develop. So they may sound like they've got it, and you hear they're communicating with other students or conversing with you, but it's so important to recognize that in order for them to demonstrate that full potential, they still may need a lot of support from you. Question we have for this one: having learned or been reminded of the differences between social and academic language, what difficulties might I find in evaluating ELL students using traditional gifted characteristics chart? So that chart that you just looked at, that I asked you to take a couple minutes, what characteristics on there might be misleading if we are trying to recognize giftedness in our English language learners? So give you just a second to think about that and share some responses if you have them, if you want to. Issues might be an advanced comprehension of word nuances, metaphors, figurative language, not having high classroom grades, advanced vocabulary, and nuanced questions. Not showing interest in general education. Cultural bias in assessment. Not understanding the deeper questions because of that language barrier. Not that they couldn't respond to it if we were able to help them understand it, so that our job in that situation would be able to help them understand. Asking higher level questions. Yeah, good examples again. I appreciate you being willing to share. humor because of puns. Oh, they're popping away now, but okay, I will definitely go back and read them. These are so fun and so insightful with this group. Okay, economically disadvantaged learners. Based on economic data from the most recent American Community Survey, approximately 21% of children are considered to be living in poverty. This is very difficult to determine accurately. There are different measures that are employed depending upon how we are talking about poverty. And we know even when we look at that poverty line, like the poverty line below the poverty line for a family of 4 is still at this point not sufficient to provide them with necessarily everything they need, in addition to any type of enrichment experiences outside the home that would cost additional money. So we know even if they're above that poverty line, they're not officially considered a household from low economic status. There are still challenges. It's very difficult to determine who is being impacted by poverty. In the schools, we most often talk about this as students that are on free and reduced meals, or they receive free and reduced lunches. That we know can be misleading also. Often as students get into high school and they are the ones that are responsible for, getting that paperwork to where it needs to be or reporting it out, that they often don't want to do that. So we don't get an accurate count that way. And it's also challenging because that information is so well protected by the district. We are not going to know who necessarily is on free and reduced lunches all the time. That being said, teachers are really intuitive in knowing which students may be impacted by this. And we know the impacts are significant for students who are chronically in poverty, and that they face multiple risk factors that other students don't necessarily experience. Now, we do know there's an overlap in many of these subpopulations of students, like Jenny said, but when we're talking about the impact of poverty, that stress, in addition to other things, places them at a higher risk as far as being able to fully demonstrate their potential to us at times. So question for you again, how have I observed economically disadvantaged students using their strengths to overcome challenges? And I know some of these are similar to what has already popped up on the discussion, but how have you seen them use those strengths to overcome challenges that they are facing? Street smarts, they're resourceful, creative problem solving, creative use of resources, value their home language, problem solving. Many become much more independent than other students, especially at an earlier age. Incredible creativity, resilience again, solving social situations. Thoughtful examples again, thank you.
So now we're going to go ahead and transition into twice exceptional learners, also known as 2E sometimes, may go by other designations as well. So when we're talking about twice exceptional learners, twice exceptional individuals evidence exceptional ability and disability. The two can coexist, which results in a unique set of circumstances. So their exceptional ability may dominate, hiding their disability. Their disability may dominate, hiding their exceptional ability. And then each may mask the other so that neither is recognized or addressed. So these students, I will say, many of the 2E students I've taught in the past, I have had doctoral students dissertate and do research on this topic. I've done research on this topic as well. We will have students who are high potential or gifted, but they don't qualify under IDEA for special education services, but they may qualify under Section 504 for accommodations. And we're not sure how it works in New Mexico, but in Colorado, students that are identified gifted and also have 504 accommodations are counted in our twice exceptional count. So This is just a diagram to show you what that masking looks like. So we might have giftedness and disability. So we can see characteristics in both. We might have giftedness, you see it bolded here, where gifted characteristics hide and sometimes compensate, for the disability, making the student potentially, appear average. I had written a piece one time about one of my twice exceptional students in 7th grade, who's actually a college student now. And it really shocked other teachers that he was in my advanced reading class, but that he had dyslexia. He was able to oftentimes compensate, but not always. And he also had a ton of support at home for helping him, with some of the skills that he was lacking within the classroom. Giftedness and disabilities. So here we have giftedness, you're not necessarily seeing it. So disabilities hide gifted characteristics. And we become maybe, and oftentimes unintentionally, we want to help. So we become more deficit focused, right? Instead of, and it doesn't always allow us then to see that giftedness, that potential. Giftedness and disabilities, this is where they kind of cancel each other out. So neither gifted characteristics nor disabilities are evident or addressed. And we have a student that maybe just appears, average or a little bit below average, but really needs support in both those areas. So having learned or been reminded that 2E students may perform below, at, or above grade level, what difficulties might I find in evaluating them for gifted behaviors using commonly held perceptions of giftedness? So let's chat about that for a minute. So they aren't doing their work in class, they can't be gifted. There's an assumption about their communication skills. What else may hinder us seeing potential in this group? They can't sit still or focus on assessments. Absolutely. They don't always perform well on standardized tests. Students frequently recommend other students for gifted motivation, different types of assessments that aren't capturing truly what these students know. They might hide their need for support and then melt down at home. Oh my goodness, absolutely. Lack of interest. They always overrule me, address the deficit first instead of using the strength to look at the deficit. Attention span, self-regulation skills. I mean, lots of things going on here. So we are gonna now come back to this and all these great comments, being behaviors preventing them from participating, including outbursts. Yes, yes, yes. We come back to that gifted education chart and a gifted characteristic chart. We are always, in any type of professional learning we do, and in professional learning with gifted education teachers, saying, this is not the end all. Kids do not have to show all or sometimes any of these traits. This is just a starting point to look at. But we have seen in practice where charts like this and rating scales have been used to exclude kids because they're not manifesting gifted behaviors in a way that others perceive as being the traditional way to look at giftedness. So looking at this again, what are the issues here in relying on a chart like this in trying to identify potential and giftedness in our underserved students? And again, it's not to say let's throw this chart out, but what are some of the potential issues? And I want you also to think about nomination. So if nomination is the first part where we have to nominate a kid, where are we going to fall with that? Ambiguity in too many areas. Kids are bored when they start school, no apparent motivation, subjective. It doesn't list the negative attributes. We're going to come back to this later. Communication may be different. Giftedness is in the eye of the beholder, and oftentimes giftedness is in the eyes of the dominant culture. We miss kids and they become dropouts due to lack of support or appropriate challenge. Amy and I did a research study on high potential students who dropped out of school. So yes, absolutely. Wonderful conversation. There are assumptions about what some of these qualifiers should be or look like in school, more positive traits. Yeah, and I like how some people are bringing up the fact that we're only looking at the positive and not seeing the flip side of that behavior, which we'll do later. So we are going to, great conversation. We're going to move on to underrepresentation.
I want to make one quick comment. We don't go back a slide, but it came through earlier on another question, just kind of scooted by, talking about nominations. Someone mentioned that talking to students about who might be into the program, or questions about why they are not. Peers are often can be a very good resource when we're talking about nominations, because they those characteristics that we sometimes see. So I just, like everything we talk about, we need to get as much of the whole picture as possible when we're looking for high potential in students. So I thought that was another good comment that I wanted to call out. So when we're talking about underrepresentation at a very, very simplistic level, we are just talking about comparing statistics within your district, demographic statistics, to what you are actually seeing identified as identified gifted education students. So you're asking, is the percentage of identified students in each demographic category similar to the overall demographics in my school, in my district, in my administrative unit, however you're breaking it down? So that's just a very basic description of underrepresentation. An example might be,
oh, and just make sure you have your microphone muted. Thank you.
If we were interested in looking at comparison between boys and girls, males, females, in gifted education, if we had about 63% of our overall demographic listed as girls in the system, then we would expect that 63% of students identified for gifted education would also be girls. This would be considered right on representation if it matches 1-to-1. If there's a significant shift above or below that 63%, then in this situation, somebody's going to be underrepresented. So if it's less than 63% of the girls identified for gifted education services, then they would be considered underrepresented. If there are more than 63%, then we would say that the boys were underrepresented. So very basic, straightforward look at underrepresentation. That's what that would be. So when we look at, and we just pulled some statistics that we found for Albuquerque Public Schools, just as a starting place. We're not going to do much with it, but we want to talk about, the Dr. Donna Ford talks about threshold, a threshold that we need to look at, 20% threshold, because we're dealing with individuals with many different factors that impact who and how we're able to identify. So that 1-to-1 representation is often unrealistic. It's unrealistic to say if we have 63%, we need 63% in order to be accurately identifying as far as representation goes. So we pulled some statistics that we found for Albuquerque Public Schools, not to do a comparison. We're not digging in to say whether or not these students are underrepresented in gifted education programming. Oh, I'm still seeing comments come in that are applicable. I love that everybody's so engaged. We appreciate it so much. But we want to give you an example of what flexibility might be when we're looking at representation. So on the next slide, Dr. Ford has come up with 20% threshold and says if you are within this threshold, you are probably doing a pretty good job. You know, continue to try and get to that 1-to-1 representation, but if you can get it within 20%, you're getting there. You're doing a good job for the majority of the students in your school or district. So if Albuquerque Public Schools has 16.6% English learners, exact representation would be that we also have 16.6% in gifted education programming. If we look at the 20% threshold, if we have at least 13.4% of our students identified for gifted programming who are English learners, we're doing a pretty good job. If 65.8% are considered Hispanic in our school or district, we would need a minimum of 52.64% identified in order to meet that 20% threshold. And then you can go back and determine exactly how many students that is. You can say, here's how many students we have. Here's how many more we would need to hit that threshold. If we have 68.2 free and reduced meals, then we're shooting for about 55% that we can also identify and provide gifted education programming for. Another question, as you look at this, as you look at your own demographics and statistics in gifted education, it's always important to consider which demographic groups are overrepresented. And that doesn't mean that we want to pull gifted education programming from them. That's not the point. We want to make sure that everyone has the programming that they need to challenge them and for them to be successful. But if you have a specific group that is tremendously overrepresented, then that's going to impact probably your underrepresented population as well. And we know that overrepresentation typically tends to be in the areas of Caucasian/white students, Asian American students, although there are subgroups within those populations that are also underrepresented. So it's hard to talk about groups as a whole. Anytime we do that, we're making generalizations. And then we know that students from households where they have middle to upper socioeconomic status also tend to be well represented, often overrepresented in gifted education and actually any type of advanced academic learning settings. Now I'm seeing 2 schools, 600 kids. We have 3 total gifted identified. Once I have 2 girls this year. Is that 2 girls total or 2 girls identified? I've experienced many more boys than girls in my classes over the last 3 years. So this sounds like maybe some of this is general demographics, so that's interesting. They won't send them to enrichment because it should be a reward or achievement. And after that's no, which we agree with. Too many special needs kids and only 1 gifted kid at our school out of 538 kids. So you are definitely aware of this and you're seeing the same types of things that actually we're seeing across the country. This is not Albuquerque Public Schools. This is something that every school district across the nation is dealing with to a degree. How do we help with those underrepresented populations? How do we make it more equitable?
So we want to talk to you, and this is actually going to be the focus of our breakout activity is implicit bias. This is a topic that I think is gaining a lot more acceptance now in discussions, but it's a hard conversation to have, to acknowledge that we all have implicit biases that may be impacting our students. So implicit bias. So explicit bias would be the conscious attitudes that we have that impact the decisions that we make. Implicit bias, it's a little trickier, right? So implicit bias are the unconscious attitudes and beliefs or unconscious stereotype associations that cause us to react either positively or negatively toward a person. Implicit bias, it can be learned over time. It can come from, where you grew up, different experiences that you have, different contextual contexts that you've lived in, gone to school in, worked in, just so many places where those assumptions, those associations are gathered over time. So these unconscious biases may be very, very different from what we consciously believe and profess. but it doesn't mean that these implicit biases don't seep in, in our interactions with colleagues, in our interactions with students, with families. And we need to be aware of them so that we can take steps to minimize these biases and the potential impact that they can have, on these people around us. So implicit biases may also affect the way in which we see and we don't see high potential from underserved populations.
So we're going to ask you to do just a quick implicit bias activity. We're going to put up some characteristics and I know many of you are in the classrooms, so as you think about your current students, which student just pops to mind first? Don't want you to process it, don't want you to think about why this student came to mind. If you're not in the classroom, you can think back to a class that you remember well. You can think about colleagues with whom you work. But as we put them up, just really quickly, you go, you're fine. Who can you think of that would fall into these categories? Who's your most dependable student, most creative student? Who has the best sense of humor? Who's your best leader? Who's your most difficult? So jot that down quickly. And then the thought process is after that initial response to consider how many of these were from traditionally underrepresented groups of gifted learners. Now this would vary if all of your students are high poverty, if all of your students are second language learners, then obviously anybody that you put in these categories would fall into one of those underrepresented populations. But it's a step in trying to recognize maybe how implicit bias might be impacting how you see your underrepresented gifted learners. And if you had more time to think about it, Jenny talked about how can we mitigate that implicit bias. It doesn't mean that that's what we necessarily believe or profess or practice, but what steps can we take like this to process through how we are responding in different ways that might keep us from seeing some of those students either in a more positive light. For the most difficult question, who did you think of for that? Was that a student from an underrepresented population? So why did that come to mind? So part of the importance of processing this is that we can't make those choices to change our behavior or to keep our implicit biases from negatively impacting students if we aren't aware of them. So it's always an ongoing process to try and become aware of what those implicit biases may be that we have. And then Jenny made a note that the full activity is in Padlet for those of you that are interested in seeing more of that.
It's actually quite a long activity with different steps. And so if you're interested in it, we copied it straight from the book so that you have it. It's in the Padlet. So for this breakout activity, we are going to need you to jot down a few of these questions or 3 of these questions and any initial thoughts you have. And then Carol will help put you in breakout rooms to discuss these questions for 15 minutes. When you're in the breakout room, if just somebody could volunteer to kind of be the person that talks to us in the board about, what your group talked about, what they found, that would be wonderful. So in your small groups, you'll discuss the following 3 questions for 15 minutes, but please go ahead and take a minute to jot down each question and any initial thoughts you have. Yes, screenshot of this. I always forget that's a possibility, but yes, screenshot would be awesome. So what are some examples of explicit and implicit bias in the classroom? And we are not asking you to identify your own explicit or implicit biases. We're just asking you to generally discuss some examples of how explicit and implicit bias may manifest in the classroom. How do implicit biases impact the academic expectations we hold for our students? What steps can you take and or have you taken to minimize the impact of implicit biases in your classroom? So those are the 3 questions we'd like you to focus on in the breakout. We're going to start up again. So we were just curious if you could just let us know in the chat, did 15 minutes feel rushed, or did it feel like enough time or too much time? Can you just indicate that for us in the chat box? Perfect, sufficient. Okay, that's good information for us to have. Thank you so much. So we could have talked for 2 hours. Amy and I were talking during the break about how, I mean, we could easily have an 8-hour PD just on this session, especially with this group. You have been amazing.
Yeah, and we really wish that we could sit in and hear, just from what the little bit that you've shared in the chat, we really wish that we could hear these fuller discussions that you're having.
So I think there's an echo when 2 of us are muted, so are unmuted. So I apologize for that. I don't think there should be an echo right now. But so what we would like to ask for you to do is whoever is kind of that point person, or it could be more than one person, if you could just in the chat, just the first question, some examples or one example that had come up in your discussion of explicit and implicit bias and how that might play out in the classroom. So can you go ahead and share that with the group? Make sure you're muted just so we don't have that feedback. So calling on boys more often than girls, ignoring quiet students who won't be able to do the activity. These kids, in quotations. We discussed how explicit, implicit biases can be in the subtle ways a teacher speaks with students. Absolutely. If teachers see special ed label, they immediately lower all expectations. That often happens. Teachers may have explicit, very blatant biases in what they say, valuing how children answer questions, and maybe those values are a little bit different. There was a great research study by Jean Peterson about how teachers from dominant cultures interact with students. Or the way that students are grouped, seating charts, placement in the class, assuming boys should be the ones to help you pick up a chair, more Black students getting suspended, choice or pronouns, how we evaluate projects. Do we give the more attractive ones better scores? The students that have more resources, parent help, materials. Some gen ed teachers may not believe in the gifted program at all, will not refer anybody. Gifted education might be seen as this extra privilege. I think some people have talked about this before, as opposed to a need that students have, right? What music or poetry we teach and value, selection of books. These are all wonderful examples. Can you now give us some, or teachers not wanting to make accommodations for 2E students, or sometimes, you know, not asking for more information about, like, if a student has an IEP. Media selected might be mostly white and male. So the decisions that we make, how these biases arise. How do implicit biases impact the academic expectations we hold for our students? What did you talk about with that question? And some of this was touched on, I think, in the first question, but how are academic expectations impacted potentially through implicit bias? Types of lessons geared toward Tier 2 without access to gen ed curriculum at grade level. So ELL students may have gaps. Assumption of a student's skill set that students don't come with. Absolutely. Core instruction instruction is more important and students have to catch up before they can go to gifted. Again, that idea of, gifted education as this kind of, I don't know, I've read some different things about that, but as more this privilege as opposed to meeting a need. Many kids feel bad because they have had the same experiences as other kids. Oh, they haven't had the same experiences as some of the other kids at a class due to behaviors. And so gaps can occur when they are capable of learning. So they're not getting the time to learn. Pre-written programs are often so rigid, there's no opportunity for gifted students to shine their unique characteristics. And we're not given the opportunity to give students opportunities to perform. Strengths versus deficits. Teachers putting low expectations on students. These students can't do this. Higher expectations at schools with more materials, lower ones at schools without them. Teachers don't value what students do bring to the classroom. They're not necessarily seeing what they do bring to the classroom. Don't offer certain things because they assume kids won't be able to do it or have the resources to complete projects. And that one size fits all attitude. These are really, comments that I wish we had the time we were in person to be able to dig into more. So what steps can you take or have you taken, especially that can help others in this group to relay, to minimize the impact of implicit biases in your classroom? Lack of connections to their home culture. We have several slides on connections tomorrow in our Understand Me presentation. Don't see giftedness if students don't have the academic language. Yes. Culture built in their lessons, being constantly, building culture into lessons. We'll talk about that tomorrow. Being constantly aware of our bias, words we use, actions we take. And we do hope you go and look closer at that activity that we posted in the Padlet. Develop lists of what giftedness looks like in a variety of cultures and abilities, or what it may look like, what it looks like within the context of your school. Sometimes don't expect enough from them if they come from one of the groups mentioned. Take the IAT, reflect. Help when a student needs supplies or, absolutely. Helping to provide families, kids with the resources they need to be able to excel. Value what students say and do as a contributor to the classroom community. Opening our eyes to the different ways that our students contribute. School-wide training on the effects of trauma and poverty, especially on brain development. So incredibly important. Lots of professional learning is needed in those areas. Provide lots of opportunities for students to show knowledge. Again, kind of what we refer to as opportunities to perform. Making it okay to not know everything, right? Yes. How you create, but how you are creative, relate that to many subjects. So not what you create, but how you are creative. That's a really important distinction, but also focusing on growth mindset after that training so that students are challenged to go beyond and that they see that their potential it's really endless and that we're their champions. That's the focus of this presentation. We want to support them. Presentation to help regular teachers think about giftedness and gifted students in a different way. And we're hoping that this material doesn't just live here, that you take this beyond, that you reach out to us if you need any support in working with other teachers, because we need to get the word out about this stuff. So I agree with that. Presentations to regular teachers. Judy mentioned that we wouldn't be able to demonstrate our knowledge of teaching if we were thrown into a Russian classroom right now. We need a variety of chances to demonstrate knowledge and ability, and we will absolutely cover that or touch on that a lot more in the next sessions. But giving students choice in how they display what they know, how they feel comfortable showing us what we know. So those are all really, really, really fantastic comments, and thank you for taking this so incredibly seriously to heart, and sharing out with us. We love the conversation and we appreciate it. We are constructivists. We believe that we learn best when we discuss and work with one another and talk to one another. So I'm going to let Amy now come back to identification issues.
Okay, this group seems to have a really good foundation on how to recognize many of the strengths and issues that may interfere at times with identifying these students. There are definite challenges that we have in this area. Can you put the next little blip up there? There we go. Thank you. We know that the way in which we identify in the school doesn't always match up with students that are traditionally underrepresented in gifted education, what their strengths are. So their giftedness, and often giftedness is not the term that is used in certain cultures and certain societies. They don't necessarily want to call out giftedness, but those strengths, the areas in which a child, what we would call demonstrates giftedness within the community or within the home. It often doesn't manifest in the way that we look for it in the schools in the traditional way. So thinking about the characteristics on the chart that we looked at, but also beyond that, we're often looking at high IQ scores or high achievement, especially those individuals who aren't completely clear on the importance to look for high potential with these students. The students from underrepresented populations in gifted education often face unique challenges. For example, they may have a lack of opportunity for early academic and enrichment experiences, especially enrichment experiences that might put them in a position to appear gifted in the classroom. Their strengths are strengths that aren't necessarily valued within the school day. Their strengths aren't recognized as potential indicators of giftedness. So we may recognize that they're good at something in particular, but we don't tie that to being a potential indicator of giftedness because of the way it presents itself. And I think what's even more difficult, what's more frustrating, and I imagine what some of you are experiencing, is that even when we do recognize and value the strengths that our students are bringing to the classroom, being able to measure them appropriately so that we can identify is an ongoing challenge.
So many of you had talked about why are we just focusing on just these positive traits and we're not looking at kind of the flip side of how these behaviors may manifest. So it was important for us just to give just a very short example of how, behaviors, what we call gifted behaviors, how we may perceive them as positively or negatively, how we may perceive that behavior as being a gifted behavior or think, oh, no way, based on that behavior, that's more a discipline issue. That's not a gifted behavior. With some of these behaviors that we're just going to show you briefly, it's important to note that for one child, that behavior may look different and depending on context. So for example, in a place that they're comfortable with versus a place that they're not comfortable with. So for example, maybe in the classroom or at school, that behavior may kind of flip and look differently. So that's why it's so incredibly important, like Amy was saying, we don't base stuff on just one data point. We need to collect multiple, pieces of information. We need to be looking at, talking to families. And we'll cover this tomorrow. We'll give you a lot more actual activities tomorrow. We need to be, observing. We need to be looking for things that kind of don't fit what we would necessarily perceive as that traditional, lens of giftedness that might feel just a little bit more comfortable to some people, and not necessarily the people in this session, but just, with lack of professional learning, with lack of graduate coursework in gifted education, sometimes you don't know what you don't know. So we want to make sure that we're helping others to not be just so tunnel vision maybe and how they're looking at giftedness and expand that to be more inclusive of students. So student A, we'll just say, is a risk taker in academic endeavors, is an adventurous in their thinking. Very positive, stuff, like to be called kind of a risk taker in academics and to be really adventurous in your thinking. So what if I, instead of that criteria, on some type of inventory. These are actually from the Slocum Payne Teacher Perceptions Inventory, where they give negative and positive indicators of different behaviors to try to capture, more students, and qualify them for giftedness. What if I said instead, is a risk taker, breaks rules, and then challenges authority when caught, unafraid to challenge others? Essentially, we have the same behavior, but our perception of that behavior is different. So how are we, when I ask for a nomination, for gifted programming, if I'm seeing the behavior of student B, is that going to be on my radar to nominate this student for gifted programming, or to dig deeper, into the student's potential? Okay. A lot of times, we have students who are students with emotional behavior disorders, for example, are not often identified for gifted programming. Students who exhibit kind of more nonconformist, non-compliant behaviors are not often identified for gifted programming. I was once told in a school when I was a teacher, and I was the 7th grade GT teacher, by the person who did gifted identification, we have a few more slots, but don't send me, because she knew I worked with a lot of the at-risk kids and underachieving kids. She's like, don't send any of these to me. Like, I need kids that are going to listen and kids that are going to do the work. I think I missed that question. Okay, so let's look at the next one. Sticks to the task, gets job done, doesn't give up easily when things are difficult. So again, positive side of that continuum of behavior. We look at the other side, avoids tending to other things that need to be done because they're not done with the task they're working on. So if we have a student and they're focused on the task that they're working on and they're invested on getting that done, before they're willing to just drop everything and move to the next task, is that necessarily something that we're going to see positively as being persistence? Like positive persistence. What are your thoughts on that? It's how it ends and how it manifests in the behavior. But that might be something that we need to dig a little bit deeper into. Deeply interested in many things, loves to learn new things. What might that look like on the flip side? Indecisive, may hop from one thing to another without closure in anything, appears random. So this child can't possibly be gifted because they don't appear to be deeply interested in one thing. Or they don't appear to be deeply interested in many things, because that's how we're viewing it, even though hopping from one thing to another, appearing random, means I have so many interests that I just want to explore, different things. We're viewing it negatively when we shouldn't be. So just a couple of the comments. It's clear why the successful gifted students are major bulk of students who are identified. Divergent thinking and deep interest should be encouraged. Depends on if what they're working on is important, in quotes. If it's a task in the classroom, they're on task. If it's in an area of interest, they could get in trouble. I have some great child finds in AP offices because students are a discipline problem due to boredom, already knowing the learning. That's a lot of my students. So these could be the same child being described by different people. That is an awesome, so that's when we're talking about, context, we're talking about perceptions. Absolutely. And I kind of hesitated to say student A and B, because depending on who's viewing the child, depending on where the child is learning, if they're interested in what they're learning, you might see these behaviors manifest differently. And that's just another argument for collecting multiple data points, for talking to multiple people.
Okay, I want to comment on one more question that popped up as you were switching slides there. Anyone who is taught gifted or who is a parent of a gifted child knows that many of these kids love to argue or debate. They don't like taking no for an answer. Um, Absolutely. And again, that is so context dependent upon whether that is perceived as a strength or as something that's negative. So next we are sharing just a little piece of an activity that we have in our book, and you can actually find this in the Padlet as well. I believe there are 15 different little prompts there to consider. But you'll also notice at the very end of the activity, we've left some blank rows because we think it's really important, just like we've said, to focus in on the individual child and think about what might be unique to that child that we did not think to even list here. The other caveat going into this is to keep in mind that these characteristics present differently, just like we've been talking about. So is there behavior that you're seeing that is challenging that might actually, if we reframed it, be considered inquisitive? So the way this is set up is you would have one sheet for each student that you are considering. You put the student name at the top, and then it's a comparison to peers. So part of what we're doing, and this gets into discussion of local norming, and we're not going to go there today, but part of what we do in gifted education, part of it's, Jenny mentioned, and I know that you are all aware that it's based on a need. It's based on services that that child needs in order to be challenged, in order to be successful. Compared to the peers in the classroom, is this a child who is exceptional in some area that may mean that we need to recommend this child to be looked at for gifted identification, or is an indicator that there are some changes that we might need to make in the classroom to better meet their needs. Regardless of what you ultimately do with this as far as formal identification, getting a good grasp of your students' strengths in comparison to others in order to figure out who needs that additional challenge and support is so important. So the first one on here is inquisitive, often asking unexpected or unconventional questions, positive or negative, depending upon your frame of mind and the particular child. So you're going to determine whether that's something maybe that you are not seeing at all now. You're seeing it start to develop. Maybe you're just doing a really great job of engaging this child, and now all of a sudden they're starting to become inquisitive and ask these questions that are just amazing questions. And then the last one is exceptional compared with his or her peers. Do you see this as an exceptional strength? One thing that's really important, we think, is that when you are seeing those exceptional strengths, that you provide some examples, that you write down as you see it. Make a note so that you have that to refer to in the future when you're discussing this child, programming for this child, or recommending this child for assessment. Is the child observant, not presently emerging, exceptional compared to peers? Does he or she express ideas well? Does he or she recall information easily? Is he or she interested in how things work? So again, this is just something to help you identify those particular strengths of your students. You can see the whole activity if you're interested in taking this and sharing it with other teachers, or utilizing it yourself in the Padlet that we have set up for you. We are actually, we're hoping to be able to work with some individual schools in the spring and maybe fill in some of those blank lines for the different schools that may be unique to the students in your school, so that other teachers have a better idea of what they might look for as far as strengths in the students in your particular setting as well.
Okay, so we are nearing the end of our presentation. We did want to make sure we leave plenty of time for questions. What we like to do at the end of these sessions, and what we have collected at the end of the chapter, are just professional learning priorities for you to be able to just rate yourself in different areas As beginning, you're aware and want to try. Developing, you've tried and or trying. Or leading, you're consistently aware, implementing changes and making others aware. Just so you can see kind of where you are, and maybe, you know, where you'd like to develop. If you'd like to get to the point where you're leading, because you already are developing, how might you begin to do that, you know, from this point on? So the first one, and you can just jot down a B, a D, or an L, and then refer back. This presentation is in the Padlet. I acknowledge that everyone has implicit biases and that mine may be opposite of my conscious beliefs. So just to yourself, you know, jot down, are you beginning in this area? Are you developing? Do you feel like you're leading? I carefully process situations in the classroom before reacting to them, to minimize the impact of my implicit biases. So I carefully process situations before just immediately reacting to them, to try to minimize the impact of my implicit biases. Do you feel like you're beginning, you're aware and want to try, you're developing, you've tried and are trying, or you're leading, you're consistently aware, implementing changes and making others aware? I regularly examine my curriculum to determine if it might be reinforcing inaccurate stereotypes or misconceptions about certain groups of students. Do you regularly examine your curriculum to determine if it might be reinforcing inaccurate stereotypes or misconceptions about certain students? Do you feel like you're beginning in this area, you're developing, or you're leading? And if you're beginning, that's okay. This is a place where you can say, you know, this might be a step or two that I take to start growing in this area, to make goals around this. I regularly reflect on what my implicit biases might be and the way they manifest in my classroom. Are you taking the time to regularly reflect on those implicit biases, and the ways they may manifest themselves? And if, you know, if you are, what are you doing? What else can you do? If you're not, you know, based on some of the discussion today, what might you do to more regularly reflect on those implicit biases and to acknowledge them so that you can take steps to mitigate them? And then lastly, I share with others in my school community how giftedness may look in underserved populations. So do you feel like you've had the opportunity, or you'd like to have the opportunity? So within your school community, this, I saw the comment, this is, you know, this families, are you talking to families? Are you talking, you know, to other educators, staff, school counselors? I mean, administrators? I mean, think of the different possibilities. Do you feel comfortable sharing with others how giftedness may look in underserved populations in order to try to identify more of these students? I'm going to leave these up. Does anybody feel like they need more time with these? Just kind of chat off to the side. I don't want to change the slide if you're still thinking about these. Okay, thank you, Marjorie. And these are good questions, honestly, if you start doing any type of training, you know, to put forth with others, you know, to think about implicit bias, to think about how we interact with our students, how we understand giftedness within the context of our school and outside of our school. Okay, thank you.